This is the S2G podcast, where we share conversations that help us understand how to scale the food, agriculture, oceans, and energy transitions. I'm your host, Tanya Bekwitzes. In this episode, Sam Kass dishes out insights from his boundary-defying career, from cooking to nutrition policy to author and food and agriculture investor. As a reminder, this content is for informational purposes only. It should not be taken as legal, business, tax, or investment advice, or be used to evaluate any investment or security, and is not directed at any investor or potential investor in any investment vehicle sponsored by S2G. Investing involves risk, including the risk of loss. Specific companies mentioned in this podcast are for educational purposes and should not be construed as an endorsement of any kind. Please note that S2G may maintain investments in some of the companies discussed on this podcast. For more important information, please see s2gventures.com/disclosures.
Most people in the good food world have a critique of the problems and then look down at the system with their vision of how they think it should be. When you're actually tasked to change it, you have to root yourself in the reality of how the system actually works and then work from that reality towards those ideals. And I think it's only then that we give ourselves a shot at actually getting something done.
When it comes to our food system, Sam Kass may have seen it all. He started his career as a chef in a renowned restaurant in Vienna, and upon returning to Chicago, found himself cooking for the Obamas and following them to the White House. While there, he served as a senior policy advisor for nutrition, as well as executive director for First Lady Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign. Since then, he's been a partner at fellow food and agriculture investment firm Acre Venture Partners and an author with a second book on the way. Through all these experiences, Sam has developed a comprehensive perspective that is grounded in reality. He is all too aware of the challenges we face in changing the food system, both from a health and environmental standpoint. After all, he has experienced many of them personally. But he remains resolutely hopeful, not only that change will happen, but that there is immense opportunity in transforming how we grow food and eat. In his first book, Eat a Little Better, he makes it easy for readers to choose and cook healthy, delicious foods. In his upcoming book, The Last Supper, he distills all his experiences into a straightforward plan to save our food system, based on 4 pillars of change: culture, policy and legislation, business, and technology. And as an investor, he is clear-eyed in his mission to drive impact and market rate returns while trying to bring others on board. In this episode, Chuck Templeton sits down with Sam to discuss his moment of clarity at a Michelin-star restaurant, how his work in nutrition policy shaped his approach to food system change, what a Thanksgiving version of a Last Supper might look like, and how we as eaters can make a real difference. Also, just a note, Sam talks about his experiences in kitchens, which are very entertaining, but not always PC. So we beeped out a few things. There's so much here, so let's get into it.
Most interviewees have a pretty straightforward set of titles. You have really evaded that and you've done so many different things, so multifaceted. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and where your interest in food came and maybe some of your early formative experiences?
Good to see you, Chuck, and excited to be here. Yeah, I've taken a kind of a windy path for sure. I'm from Chicago. I grew up trying to be a baseball player. It's the only thing I could dream of when I was basically through college, actually. But started taking a different path in my final semester. I ended up going to the University of Chicago and had 1 quarter left. And so kicked my way into an abroad program in Vienna. And at that point, I'd cooked one summer in this sort of Italian-American joint in Chicago called 312 Chicago. Because I just wanted to learn how to cook one day for like my future family. Like I never had any dreams of being a chef in any way, but felt if you know how to cook, your life is better than if you don't. And so when I got to Vienna, I had said to the head of the program, I'm interested in food. I hear they have nice pastries here. I'd love to go volunteer once a week or something. Just I'm curious about it. And she came back and said, my husband's uncle's friend from college, son, rides bicycles with the sous chef at the best restaurant in Vienna. He's willing to meet you tomorrow if you're interested. And this was my second day there. I was 22. And yeah, I met this guy on the street randomly, and he invited me in the kitchen. And I went and worked a service that next night
Wow.
and just
That's
absolutely
pretty
fell
good.
in love.
That's awesome.
And the chef actually, so he was the sous chef, and to this day, the best chef I've ever worked with. The executive chef was this big, imposing man. And so at that night of my first service, the end of the night, he calls me over. He says, Yankee. They call me Yankee. He says, Yankee calls me over. He puts a scallop on one of those very thin pastry knives, spatulas, like those really thin ones. And he says, take this, it's like a raw scallop on this spatula. Take it to that other chef across the kitchen. So I walk this scallop over to the guy and I hand it to him. He looks at me like I'm absolutely crazy. And the head chef turns and says, you can come back to my kitchen anytime. And I did. So I ended up coming back for the next 3.5 months. So I finished my degree and then ended up returning without papers a couple months later. It turned out he was testing me to just see if I had a steady hand. Because I can teach you everything, but I can't teach you a steady hand. And so I got my training in Vienna and cooked and traveled my way around the world. Quickly started realizing the impact the food was having both on human health and environmental health from that very early time in the restaurant, and started studying and researching those issues as I traveled my way for about 5 years, and then came back to Chicago trying to get involved in food politics and policy, and realizing that chefs really had no real voice in the issues at all. And that's all I had figured out. But when I came back to Chicago, it was just a couple months after then Senator Obama had launched his campaign, and got reconnected with them and started helping out Michelle and helped take care of the girls during the campaign, and went from there. And did all the work in the White House for both him on the policy side and for Let's Move. And I cooked. And now we are fellow travelers and trying to change the world through investment and building the company of the future. And
Very
I'm
nice.
at a firm called Acre.
Acre Ventures, yeah. But let's go back a little bit with how did you start to think about food and nutrition and environment together? Because most people think about food and taste, food and satiation, those types of things. How did you start to connect some of those dots early on?
There was actually this one very specific moment that completely changed my trajectory when I went back. And that was when they're like, all right, now we will turn you into a cook, like a real chef. First cook, then chef, let's go. And they were kicking my butt super hard. And early on, the sous chef said, okay, we have a foie gras dish, make a rhubarb sauce for it, which entailed, I'll tell you how they said it.
Yeah, let's hear it.
He said, Yankee, cook the rhubarb down and then in the butter. I was like, okay, I guess that means a lot of butter. So I cooked this rhubarb down. I put a ton of butter in. And he's watching me. So he said, no, I said in the butter. So I took another giant, huge scoop of butter and put it in there. And he comes right up into my face and he said, if the guest walks out of this restaurant and drops dead of a heart attack, it's not my problem. The guests are asking us to make food that tastes good, not that's good for them. And with that, he took basically the rest of the butter in the whole pan and just dumped it in. He was yelling at me and really totally embarrassed me. So I went back to my station and I was just reeling. One, because he was right. That is what we had as sort of society been asking chefs and food companies. This was 20 years ago. So he was right. But two, he was also that's so messed up. And I started immediately. So I look out in the dining room and you could, a half open kitchen. So I looked out in the dining room. I just started looking at everybody out there eating the food that we were making. And this was a very fancy Michelin-star restaurant, right? So it was high quality food. And I just looked at everybody. I realized God, everybody looks sick. People don't look well. And I started asking myself a very simple question. I wonder what the implications of the food that I'm serving has on the well-being of the people who are eating it. And I had been going home after work and reading through every cookbook I get my hands on. I was studying aggressively everything I could. And after that moment, I started trying to find food policy books, history of agriculture books, and started trying to understand those two fundamental questions. And it did not take long to realize that food and agriculture, the way we feed ourselves, is at the root of so many of the challenges that we face, and also holds the keys to so many of the solutions that we're seeking. And it totally set me on a different path. And that's really what put me in a position that when I had the opportunity to start working for the Obamas, I was prepared for a different role than a chef would otherwise have there.
Yeah, two sort of comments on that. One is that it feels to me like people understand the link between food and nutrition, but not food and environment. But you went that extra step and really figured out the food and environment also. And then two is that a lot of people also believe you can't make food taste good and be nutritious. And I think both of those are big themes out in the world that I think you've spent a lot of your career working on both those perceptions. And so you moved back to the States. And how did you connect with the Obamas? What was the original story there?
So I'm from Hyde Park. I knew them a bit when I was in high school. Hyde Park is where the University of Chicago is. It's a very tight-knit community. But I totally lost track of them as I went off to college and then went off in the world. But I was cooking for a family in Chicago, and they had donated some money to Barack's first state Senate campaign. And the dad of that family ran into Michelle on a flight, and they started talking, and he had lost a bunch of weight because I'd cooked very health-minded cooking. And they put two and two together that like Sam, like that kid that I knew, I haven't seen him in so many years. And Barack had just launched the campaign about 2 months prior, and they had no staff or anything. They were regular people until he won the Senate seat, and then he was doing a lot of travel, and he was starting a campaign, and Michelle had 2 young kids and a full-time job, and they connected me, and so I started cooking for them every other night. That's how we ended up doing it. It took a little while to do some trials and get the president comfortable with the idea of having a chef, which he really wasn't, then just senator. He really wasn't at the time, but he made him an offer he couldn't refuse. So.
So Sam started cooking for the Obamas, but when Michelle Obama began to see the impact that his focus on healthy food had on her kids, she knew they had to dream bigger.
The first thing that I did with them when I got there is I with Sasha and Malia, who were like 8 and 5 or something. I went around with them and went through all the stuff in their cabinets. And we went through and just started looking at reading the labels together. And there's nothing cuter than like an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old trying to pronounce the words on those packs of food that they definitely should not have been eating. And so I cleaned out their cabinet. So from the very beginning, it was talking about how do we improve their health as a family. And Michelle, she had actually just not too long before I started, had gone to the pediatrician. And the pediatrician, she told the story a bunch, that had said, hey, you should be a little careful. I'm starting to see some trends in their numbers that are okay, but are a little concerning if they continue. And this came as a real shock. And so as we started making those changes, when she went back to the pediatrician, was like totally confused because their numbers were like perfect just in a matter of months. And I think she really saw the power of food to like quickly improve the well-being of her own kids. And through that process, we started talking about what was happening in society. 1 in 3 kids were on track to have diabetes and all the issues related to health and food. And she really started living that.
Which that had to be hard, being on the road as much as they were, as busy as their lifestyles were. I mean, there had to be a discipline on their end too to make this happen.
Yeah. And look, that's the truth for so many people, right? They're living in environments that it's hard to eat well. So I think that too reinforced why this kind of work was so important. And that if she was struggling with this, God, can you imagine living with no real education, no financial resources, like how difficult it is to feed your family well, and the problems that society is facing on kind of every level, healthcare costs, education, our economy. That's really started compelling us to start dreaming and envisioning what we could do if we got to the White House. And she actually tells the story in her book. There was one night where we got really carried away. We started dreaming, okay, if we got in there, first we could do a garden. And then from there, we could launch a big public health campaign, focus on kids and families, and we could work on schools. And like, we got super excited. And then we realized, like, this dude's name is Barack Hussein Obama. He's 30 points down the polls. Nobody knows who he is. What are we talking about? We started laughing. And he pulled it off. Then away we went.
Yeah. And so as you leaned into policy work, what were some of the key learnings that you did in order to move the needle forward in politics and nutrition policy? What are some of the things that you were able to tangibly push forward?
Well, I think the biggest initial shift in my thinking, when Michelle Obama looks at you and says, okay, we're here now, go do it. Go make the change. Go fix food. Go have an impact and show me results. I'm not here for press releases or fun events or like my legacy. I care about real change. So go. It's on you. That's some intense stuff. And I think what fundamentally first shifted is most people in the good food world have a critique of the problems and then look down at the system with their vision of how they think it should be. When you're actually tasked to change it, you have to root yourself in the reality of how the system actually works and then work from that reality towards those ideals. And it's a very different orientation to the questions, to the problems, to the strategies. And I think it's only then that we give ourselves a shot at actually getting something done, as opposed to being critical and saying how messed up everything is, but ultimately sidelining ourselves from the way the real world is actually operating.
Yeah, it's sort of easy to point fingers and just be like, oh, it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. But then actually, that's the reality of it, right? If people have their habits, they're used to doing things a certain way, you have to figure out how to change all of that, right?
All of it. And you have to know where there's chance to make change, given all the various elements of what change looks like, particularly at that level, and where there are other issues that are super important, so we're just not ready for them yet. And trying to analyze where are you best positioned to have a big impact? How do you position the issue? We worked very hard to position her and these issues in a way that was very difficult to attack. Who's against child health? Really, you think kids should be eating junk food in schools? We positioned it in a way that felt a little lighter. It felt more universal, very tactively, so that it was harder to attack.
Yeah. It sounds like a phenomenal original platform to have that you can really learn a lot, test a lot of different avenues, and really think about how to move this forward. So since then, you founded Trove. You've become a partner at Acre Ventures. You've written 2 books, Eat a Little Better and The Last Supper, or The Last Supper is coming out here shortly. By the way, I was flipping through Eat a Little Better, and there's a lot in there, but in particular, I'm a huge corn fan. And so the chili roasted corn look really good. And then the slow roasted salmon with barbecue sauce also look really good. There was probably, 100 other recipes in there that also look really good. And what was the intention of the book then? Talk through how you came up with that as the right platform for you to be able to communicate and articulate out.
Yeah, look, I think a lot of the change that we need to see is going to come in our homes, meal by meal. In the end, that is the change, right? Ultimately, all the things we're working towards is to try to get the food that ends up on people's plates to be healthier and grown in a more sustainable, regenerative way. And so cooking is one of the best tools we have to make that change. Even if you're cooking what would be perceived as unhealthy recipes, it's almost always better than what you get in a fast food restaurant, or most restaurants even in general. People tend to not put the same amount of salt, sugar, and fat in their own food than restaurants do to make it taste this extravagantly rich, delicious way. The portions are way bigger in many of these restaurants. And so you just end up consuming more of the things you don't want to have and less of the things you do than when you cook at home. But I do feel like part of the aim of that book was so many of us, and these are all my friends and I love them and respect them dearly, but so many of us on this side of the work are incredibly idealistic and are really detached from the realities that most people are facing when it comes to putting food on their table. And I do not think we have focused in on the how. How are people actually going to do this? Everybody's focused on the what, what's wrong. Some have what to do, but it's really light and generally not that nuanced. But we haven't focused on the how. And so both the books really are about the how. Here's how you can cook better in a very simple, pragmatic way. Here's the basic techniques that you could then use in a bunch of different formats, and just how do you fit better cooking in the lives of people who got 1 or 2 jobs, got a couple of kids, might be taking care of their parents. We're all dealing with a lot of stuff. It's a lot to ask of people to try to overhaul everything. And so this book would try to have a pragmatic, bit by bit, how do you make things in your world better by simply setting yourself up for success? So that's really the main themes of that book.
Sam's second book, The Last Supper, How to Overcome the Future Food Crisis, comes out this summer. In it, Sam compiles everything he's learned through the many stages of his career and shares an action-based plan rooted in the principle of maximizing nutrient production while minimizing environmental damage.
And The Last Supper, which will be out this summer, if all goes as planned. So it talks about what's starting to happen in our food system because of climate change, the impact is having on our ability to produce food and the challenges that we are already facing and that we will absolutely face in the decades to come. And when you get into the data, it's pretty dire, frankly, about what the future looks like. Many of the things that we hold dear, like coffee, wine, chocolate, shellfish, nuts, all kinds of foods that we take for granted and eat every day. And the economic implications of that globally are pretty severe. So it tries to help people understand what's at stake when we're talking about these issues. There's much more around, okay, if we're serious about changing the food system, like how do we do it? I spend almost no time on what's wrong and try to spend the whole book on if we're serious about change, what does that mean?
So you have these 4 pillars of change that are sort of part of the framework that you use for the Last Supper. Is that right? Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which are policy is one and business. And I think underpinning everything is culture. And I do think that's the part that we conveniently skip over because it's the hard, messy, slow, long work. But until our culture values both better health and better sustainability in our food system, politicians aren't going to do all that much on it because nobody's voting on the issue. Businesses aren't going to do that much on it because nobody's buying the foods that are more sustainably produced. And we're only going to go as far as our culture sort of demands. And so working on that cultural shift, I think, is critical. And then I think the fourth part is technology and innovation. We are going to need new tools.
It's culture, it's policy, it's business, and it's technology. Are those the 4
exactly.
Sort of pillars that you talk about?
Yeah, that's the sort of recipe for a transformed food system bit by bit over time.
And then what's a Last Supper? Talk us through what a Last Supper is.
The Last Supper has taken on a bit of a life of its own, honestly. I did the first one at COP21 in Paris when we were trying to get the big accords done. And back then, nobody was talking about the intersection of food and climate. And any of these big world events, like it just simply was not being discussed. And so I went to Paris to try to do some of these dinners to try to help create the connections between food and climate and food and the environment. And so it's a menu that's put together with all of these ingredients that at the time I would frame it as our kids and grandkids won't have access to. And unfortunately, I haven't been doing them now for, it's been about 10 years. And it's like happening now. We lost 95% of the Georgia peach crop last year. The snow crab fishery, the salmon fishery on the West Coast and Pacific Northwest have been closed for the last couple of years because there's just no crab or there's no salmon because the waters are too warm and becoming acidified from absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. So all these different things. So basically it's a menu that highlights all these different ingredients. And I tell this story about what's happening to these ingredients and what's going to happen to them if we stay on the course that we're on.
So a lot of these ingredients are featured in the meals then that you're cooking, and then there's a dialogue about them and how they're under attack from the climate changing aspects.
Exactly. And it's a lot of these like coffee, wine, and chocolate. For me, coffee and wine are literally the what courses through my veins on any given day. And everybody has the ingredient that resonates with them most. Where it starts to get scary is when you look at the models around wheat, around rice. It's like almost 60% of those calories of those crops. And the decline in the yields of those key commodities is pretty scary. And the food insecurity is going to be a result of political instability, forced migrations. Like it starts to get pretty intense and hard to comprehend the implications. So I talk about the range of things. It hits pretty hard.
Yeah.
It's pretty intense. And I got to work to lift people up and then talk about all the technology innovations that S2G is working, the kind of stuff you guys do, kind of stuff we do at Acre, what the stuff I do with Spring, and talk about what new ways of doing and that we can solve these challenges. We just have to get going because we're out of time.
Yeah. And that we can solve them, but I also think there's big opportunities, right? There are problems, but there's opportunities here to be able to do it in ways that we can have farmers make more money. We can have people eat healthier and spend less money on medical and other issues. Food is so much culture of sitting around the table and being able to enjoy it with friends and stuff like that. That should make it an awesome opportunity, frankly, in my opinion, as we move forward.
I could not agree with you more. From the health standpoint, like it's obvious. It's just so much of our expenditure on healthcare is food related. It's the number one driver of preventable death and disease by a lot.
Yep.
You know, there's like very simple math there. But on the climate side too, there's a lot of money flowing into all kinds of different technologies like direct air capture and all this other stuff. Nothing in the space has the capacity to solve the challenges that we have towards removing carbon from our atmosphere in the time horizon the science says that we have than our food and agricultural systems. Like nothing comes close. And the other industries that get so much of the focus, like energy, which is obviously the biggest driver of emissions and absolutely needs to be a priority to reduce, or mobility, like the best we can do there is just to do less harm. None of that can actually sequester any kind of carbon. And not only is food and agriculture the number 2 driver of emissions on a global basis, it's the only system on planet Earth that can sequester enough carbon to make a real difference. And so we have an opportunity here that's just unparalleled and is still, though, not getting anywhere near the sort of attention resource from both the research standpoint as well as an investment standpoint in every asset class that is needed to really unlock that system. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, but I think we're going to have to get there. And the other thing is, food is on the front lines of climate. So we're going to have to figure out not only like how do we unlock the power to solve the challenges, but we also have to figure out how to adapt to a changing climate and make sure that we can continue to produce food in a much more difficult environment than we have before. And so we have a lot of work to do to ready the system for that.
Are there some things in particular that the everyday consumer could do that help this? Everyone talks about we eat 3 times a day. And what are some of those quick, super easy things consumers could do?
I'll give 2 things. The first and most obvious thing by the data is just we need to eat less meat, and particularly less red meat. To the extent, and I say that as a meat eater, I am no vegan, and I will never be. No offense to my vegan friends, I love you guys, but that's just not my thing. But I'm definitely working very hard to eat less meat. And when I do eat meat, I eat smaller portions of it. And we really need to be dramatically reducing the amount of beef we consume. Beef is by far the biggest driver of emissions in the food and ag system. And that's the one thing we could do to make a big difference. Certainly the beef that we generally consume in supermarkets. There's a big debate about grass-fed. It's definitely better for the soil build, soil health, et cetera. Still has a pretty big footprint, though. That is a good place to start. I think the second thing to do is support brands that are making claims around the environment. I don't expect people to know whether what that company is saying is real or not. And frankly, I don't think you need to. Obviously, if you want to do your homework, great. I'm not trying to dissuade you from it. Some companies are really doing the right thing. Some companies are doing a little bit and saying a lot. Either way, that's a positive thing. What we have to start to show in the market is that consumers are making buying decisions based on environmental attributes. And that in and of itself, sending that signal, will be transformational. Right now, the signal we're sending these companies is we don't care about this. We say we do, but then when it comes to what we actually buy, it's not having any impact. And that has to fundamentally change if we want to see companies starting to change how they do business. And then in a couple of years, when we're all doing that, then we can do the work and the advocates will do their jobs and start to get under the hood and say, this company is doing a really good job. Like that company should be sued for misleading marketing, whatever the case may be. And we can do the work of then holding these companies accountable to actually doing what they say they're doing. But for now, don't worry about whether you know if it's true or not. Just buy the one that's making a claim. That would be a big deal.
Yeah, don't let perfection be the enemy of progress. And that's the thing about eating is you eat multiple times a day. You're eating in multiple locations, whether it's in between your afternoon snack or flying through the airport to go someplace else or whatever. There's always these these opportunities to make some of those. So thinking about that, Thanksgiving, how would you think about doing a Last Supper for Thanksgiving if someone wanted to try some stuff and be creative? Like, what would a good Thanksgiving meal look like in this world?
Many of the things on our Thanksgiving Day plates are on the list. So you could do a Last Supper just by your Thanksgiving dinner. So you could start, depending on whether you have a bread stuffing or rice stuffing, both rice and wheat are being decimated and have a very difficult future. The wine in your glass is also right up there. Depending on what you do for your dessert, I guess some people do a chocolate pie. Maybe not the most traditional. So pumpkins, I think, are fine. I'm not worried about pumpkins. Brussels sprouts are good, or green beans or greens, whatever. The vegetables are okay, and largely because, one, they have a very low footprint, and two, they're easily moved around. So as the climate changes, you can start growing Brussels sprouts in a different region without too much cost. A lot of the problems related to trees, anything that's produced on a tree, stone fruit or nuts or vine, like wine, coffee is a tree. As it goes, turkeys aren't terrible. So I don't have any problem with a turkey now. They're not the most delicious thing to eat. So I'll admit that sometimes I make duck instead of turkey, which I know is going to offend some people, but it's been done and I said it.
Yeah.
But I think it's a pretty sustainable meal per se, but definitely the impacts of the environment are playing out on that meal for sure.
We're going to think about that for our Thanksgiving dinner coming up as well. So we'll mix in some things and report back, and certainly check out your book to maybe find a recipe or two to sneak in there. So maybe we end here the conversation just a little bit about what we both do in common these days, and that is trying to invest in making a food system more sustainable and healthy and mitigate and adapt to climate change. And so how do you think about the future? Obviously, from an insider, we've had the sort of boom over the last up through maybe even into 22, and then we're in a little bit of a bust cycle right now in 23 and 24. Like, how do you think about the future of food investing and food technology?
Yeah, for all the work we're doing at Acre, not dissimilar. I've always felt like we're like fellow travelers, first cousins, or how you want to call it, with S2G. And we've been on this journey basically from about the same time. And I still think we're at the very earliest stages here. Like, we're still in the first inning of this work. And there really wasn't much happening before we started doing it. And if you look at the arc of other industries, it takes decades to stand these things up. And food and agriculture has been around for a long time, has deep cultural roots, both on the food, like eater side, but also on the farmer and production side. And there's a ton of risk that the system manages on any given day. And between the investments in that system and the risk that producers have to take on any given moment, change is slow and change is hard, and for good reason. And so I think, like, we're all continuing to work to both figure out, like, where's the value creation? How do you make these new pieces of technology or new models fit in the economic reality that the system faces? And how do you start getting real scale to these new ways of working? And I think the reality of climate change and the reality of the degradation of human health are increasingly going to force the hand of the system to change. Like, we will just be given less and less choice. And the more dire things get, the more open-minded people are going to be to trying new ways of doing it. But there's challenges there. The more challenging things get, the less economic resources that people have to mitigate risk or spend the money to do something different. And it's a complicated path, but I think the change has to happen. It's absolutely inevitable. And we're trying to, make sure that we have the new ways of food production that's going to step in and help the society solve some of the biggest challenges that humanity has ever faced. And so I think that's the work, and we got a long way to go. So I'm very excited and continually optimistic about what's possible here. But yeah, the challenges are real, man.
Yeah.
And it's hard on lots of levels, and we need way more capital flowing into the space at every asset class to help pave the path for these companies to get to scale and to really start getting that widespread adoption. And that's the work. And that's what we're doing every day.
And I actually think, like, so the internet had its boom and bust, right? And it's done okay since then. Sorry, a little sarcasm there. But they learned what the dynamics and the structure of the market were, and they started investing appropriately. And some of the models early on didn't have the right, like AWS came along and really helped a lot of companies not needing to build their own storage and application layer of all the technology and whatnot. And I think you're seeing a lot of that in the food system as well, whereas a lot of the early investments from mid-teens up to even in the early 20s, a lot of that companies were needing to build everything from soup to nuts to their own manufacturing capability, all these sort of heavy cost infrastructure types of needs. And I think now a lot of these companies, the entrepreneurs have come in and really changed how they're looking at the models and how do you make it be successful in what the reality of the food system is, and not what we imagine it to be, but what the reality is. And so I do think that there's a lot of entrepreneurs who are now looking at the challenges in a different way. And so there is a lot of, I think, like you said, optimism towards figuring this stuff out. And so there's this last 10 years has really, to me, been a huge awakening as to what the path forward is, I think. And I think it can be very successful.
I couldn't agree with that more. That's why we need more capital, like-minded capital that has a longer term view of what we're building here over time to get in this game and set up an ecosystem that can help really protect these companies as they build their strength in the marketplace so that they can dictate those terms.
Awesome, Sam. I could talk for hours with you. I always appreciate it. Thank you very much for your time and perspective and for really doing what you do. I really appreciate it. We're all better off because of the work you're doing. And so, again, thank you for that. And I'm excited to see where you're going in the future.
And that means so much. And lots ahead of us. Excited to keep building together. And thanks for having me, man. It's been super fun.
Let's do it. See you around.
Happy Thanksgiving from all of us at S2G. We're grateful for this ever-growing community, putting so much hard work and ingenuity into solutions that can create a better future for people and the planet. Thank you for tuning in to the S2G podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, or share it with a friend. For more information or to connect with us, check out s2gventures.com.